There's a lot. I think the nice thing about self-compassion is it's really very, very simple. Be a good friend to yourself. Would you say that to a friend? Would you act that way to a friend? Often the answer is no. Okay, so then what would you say to a friend? How would you treat someone you really cared about? It's usually kind of obvious. So it's really quite a simple practice. It doesn't require hours of meditation like mindfulness does. It doesn't require any particular knowledge of how the body works. All it requires is knowing what it looks like to be a good supportive friend. Most people have some experience with that.
The Vidal Speaks podcast.
Episode 89. Dr. Kristin Neff, Compassion, Self-Compassion, and Self-Esteem. Welcome to Vidal Speaks. My name is Deborah Vidal, former 11-year LPGA golf pro turned classical homeopath, certified plant-based nutritionist, and wellness coach. Each week here on Vidal Speaks, we bring you knowledge, inspiration, or natural remedies to help you take charge of your health and feel your best. I believe health is freedom and knowledge is power, so tuning in each week will give you the power to take steps towards freeing yourself from the chains that hold you back from having the energy to do all you want in life. No matter where you are in your journey of wellness, Vidal Speaks can help. I promise. Hi, Vidal Speakers. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Well, your day is about to get better because today we're going to speak about self-compassion. I believe so much in people trying to be more compassionate to each other, especially in today's world. And when I was looking into research who I could get to speak on compassion, I came across the work of Dr. Kristin Neff. Dr. Neff's work is on self-compassion. At first I thought, wow, self-compassion, really? Because it seems so many people are selfish and even narcissistic. But then after researching Dr. Neff's work, I learned that she too speaks of narcissism on the rise, and yet she speaks and writes a lot about the importance of self-compassion still. So today we're going to learn the difference between self-esteem, narcissism, and self-compassion, and why self-compassion is essential for us to maintain a balanced, healthy state, both physically and emotionally. Dr. Neff's work came from her own life experience, which she speaks about in our interview, and that always makes a person more knowledgeable when they too have been in a state that they had to find their way out of. We all know what compassion is, and many think of it as giving compassion out to others. But after today, maybe we can all be a bit more mindful just how we speak or treat ourselves. So let's jump right into our interview with Dr. Neff. But first, let me tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Kristin Neff, PhD, studied communications as an undergraduate at the University of California at Los Angeles. She did her graduate work at University of California at Berkeley, studying moral development with Dr. Elliot Turiel. Her dissertation research was conducted in Mysore, India, where she examined children's moral reasoning. She then spent 2 years of post-doctoral study with Dr. Susan Harter at Denver University, studying issues of authenticity and self-concept development. She is currently an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. During Kristin's last year of graduate school, she became interested in Buddhism and has been practicing meditation in the Insight meditation tradition ever since. While doing her postdoctoral work, she decided to conduct research on self-compassion, a central construct in Buddhist psychology and one that has not yet been examined empirically. In addition to her pioneering research into self-compassion, she has developed an 8-week program to teach self-compassion skills. The program, co-created with her colleague Chris Germer, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, is called Mindful Self-Compassion, and it starts next week in October, guys. Her book is Self-Compassion, and it was published by William Morrow in April 2011. Okay, now let's go talk to Dr. Neff. Hello, Professor Neff. Thank you so much for joining me today to speak about your work on self-compassion. And I really look forward to a great discussion about this because I think it's kind of the buzzword today, compassion, self-compassion. So thanks and welcome.
Thanks for having me, and nice to be able to speak with you.
I know you're working on a new course, and we're going to get into that later, but let's talk first about compassion and self-compassion. And I really want to know how you first got interested in this at all.
Right. So, well, for me, it came through personal practice, actually. The story is it was my last year of graduate school at UC Berkeley, and my life was a mess, to put it bluntly. I just gotten out of a messy divorce. I was feeling a lot of shame. I was under a lot of stress about finishing up my PhD. So I thought I'd learn how to meditate. And so I went to a group. It was actually a group that taught using Thich Nhat Hanh's principles and methods. And, to my surprise, more than meditation, they talked about self-compassion, about how important it was to be kind to yourself and supportive and give yourself, the compassion that we normally reserve for others. And so I tried it out, and I was just amazed at the immediate impact it had on my life. And so since I did go on to have an academic career, I decided I wanted to study this, scientifically, and have made it my life's work.
Wow, that's very interesting. And isn't that group a form of Buddhism or a Buddhist kind of meditation?
Yes. Thich Nhat Hanh, as everyone knows who he is. Yeah, he's a Buddhist Zen master from Vietnam. So
now I'm pretty familiar with Buddhist, definitely not the expert, but because I was a pro golfer and I played 10 weeks a year for 11 years in Japan, and all my friends were Buddhists there. So I learned really a lot about it and learned to kind of embrace and love a lot of what they talk about. And some of my questions today are going to be about that. But another thing that you talk about in your book is self-esteem. So maybe that's a good place to start, like self-compassion, self-esteem. What's the difference?
Right. Yeah. So what had actually happened was I was practicing self-compassion in my personal life, more through the Buddhist path. But then in my professional life, I was learning about self-esteem and really discovering all the problems with self-esteem. So if we think of self-esteem simply as judging yourself positively, like, checking that box, I like myself very much, as opposed to I hate myself. We know that it's good to have high self-esteem as opposed to low self-esteem. The problem with self-esteem, though, is how you get it. A lot of people get it from having to feel special and above average, or feeling better than other people. And the other problem with self-esteem is it tends to be contingent. In other words, it's there for you when you succeed, but it deserts you when you fail. So self-compassion actually steps in precisely when self-esteem deserts you, and that's when you fail. You're feeling bad about yourself. So self-compassion is really just, instead of judging yourself positively, it just means treating yourself kindly, especially when you're struggling in some way. Just like you'd show compassion to a friend who's struggling, it means you show compassion to yourself. So it's really, the two do overlap. If you have self-compassion, you're also likely to have higher self-esteem. But it's not a matter of judging yourself positively or rating yourself high. It's just a matter of being a good friend to yourself, being kind.
Well, I'm interested what you said about that with self-esteem, because don't you think a lot of modern day parenting is kind of falsely raising self-esteem in a way that may not be real healthy?
Yeah, that's the problem. A lot of psychologists who studied the self-esteem movement said that, the unintentional impact of that was narcissism, right? We've got a generation of narcissists in part because well-meaning parents and teachers wanted to make sure that kids had healthy self-esteem. So again, there's nothing wrong with self-esteem. We don't want people to hate themselves, but you get self-esteem by feeling better than others, by being prejudiced, by being narcissistic. For instance, why do kids start to bully in about 5th grade? Because they don't know themselves very well, so they can have high self-esteem by being the bigger, stronger kid who successfully picks on the weaker, nerdy kid, right?
Right.
So, feeling good about yourself in and of itself is less important than how do you feel good about yourself. We need to feel good about ourselves, but just because we're human beings doing the best we can, as opposed to because we're perfect or better than other people.
Right. And at some point, isn't it? I mean, not everyone, if it's all kind of competitive and self-esteem is based on being better than someone, then how does everyone have a good self-esteem? Because somebody's got to be below the other.
That's right. I mean, so think about that. If we all have to be above average to feel good about ourselves, our self-esteem is predicated on a logical impossibility,
Right.
So that's a problem.
That's a problem.
We puff ourselves up or, try to see the worst in others so we can feel better about ourselves. And you don't have to do any of that with self-compassion. All you're really doing is the very humble task of including yourself in the circle of compassion, being kind and understanding toward yourself and others. Everyone's worthy of compassion. That's the
And I see how they're all related, and I want to get deeper into self-compassion, but I want to understand what you're talking about self-esteem and especially narcissism, because there's a lot I want to talk to you about that.
Okay.
But one of the things, I just had an interview with Jeremy Kingsley, and he was talking about how when we raise our kids, it's kind of you get a trophy if you just show up now.
Yeah.
And this is causing a big problem because in workplaces, then kids think they just show up and they should get a raise in 3 weeks and they really haven't done anything. And
Right.
It's a similar thing in what you're saying. If you're just, I don't know, I feel like it's a bit of a me society right now.
Yeah.
And so part of this is a very selfish way when you think of me society. Yet, I know you're talking about self-compassion, which is about putting a bit more focus on being nice to yourself. So there's a part of this where I feel like there's got to be a fine line.
Yeah, so a lot of it is wisdom, right? So you don't have to get a trophy saying, I'm great, I'm special because I participated. I mean, what self-compassion allows you to do is to look failure straight in the face and say, wow, I really failed. This is where I went wrong. How can I learn from this, right? I mean, that's what compassion is how can we learn from failure? So we don't want to say we didn't fail when we did. That's not good for anyone. We don't want to give ourselves a trophy if we haven't accomplished anything. But on the other hand, we don't want to beat ourselves up mercilessly because we aren't perfect, because that also doesn't help either. Right. And so, for instance, they know that self-compassion is a better motivator than self-esteem. This idea that, being a supportive, compassionate person to yourself, giving yourself constructive criticism, learning from your failure, that what that does is it decreases performance anxiety and allows you to keep trying even when times are difficult. So self-esteem it's kind of barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, right? Because it's not about, are you a good person? Are you a bad person? It's not about, are you a success or a failure? It's about, are you trying? And if things go wrong, how can you change? How can you try again? What can you learn from this? It's a real different angle from which to approach both motivation and how we relate to ourselves.
So should we lose the idea of self-esteem, or is there such a thing as a child being raised with a healthy self-esteem?
Yeah, no, I think there is healthy self-esteem, and it tends to be more unconditional. Now, of course, part of this is, your parents, you want to be absolutely sure that your parents love you unconditionally. So if you come home with a failing math grade, your parent still loves you. The bottom line is you're okay even though you failed. But for the parent to say, oh, it doesn't matter if you failed or give you a trophy anyway, or, it's okay, little Johnny, that's not good either, because if the child has a failing math grade, they aren't going to be able to get into college and succeed. So it's really about, I love you anyway, you failed, but how can I help you get your math grades up? I'm here for you, I support you. Really, so it's about kind of helping ourselves support productive change through kindness and kind of, believing in ourselves, encouraging ourselves, using constructive criticism, as opposed to just arbitrarily saying we're good or that we're bad, because we aren't perfect.
Yeah, and it seems society is so extreme these days. You're either good or you're bad.
That's right. Exactly.
And everything's kind of out of balance. I was even looking today when we were hiking, everything's so extreme. They can't just walk, but now they're carrying like weights on their backs and their ankles and breathing masks. And I'm like, wow, it's just, everything's just over the top these days. It's crazy. Yeah. But what do you think about kids that are raised in abusive homes, whether it's not necessarily meaning physically abuses, but just kids that are criticized all the time? How does this affect their self-esteem? And I mean, are they the one that go on to become bullies to try to get it themselves? Or, are they the ones that get picked on, and do they have a chance, or are they just doomed in life until they figure it out?
Well, I mean, certainly if kids do not feel unconditionally loved and supported by their parents, they're going to have insecure attachment, and it's going to lead to all sorts of problems. It could be either the kid that's bullied or the one who is a bully. It just kind of depends on the context. But certainly that child is not going to believe in themselves deep down. And what happens if your parents are very critical is you often internalize that self-criticism, and you have a very strong inner critic, and it's much more difficult for you to be self-compassionate. Now, the good news is it looks like pretty much anyone can learn the skill, because even people maybe who have a very internally harsh voice, most people have some experience with being a good friend to someone or their children or someone in their life. They've learned the skill of, how do I be supportive? How do I be warm? How do I be understanding? Maybe you aren't that way all the time, but you've got some experience with it. So basically all you need to do is learn to start to speak to yourself that way, with warmth, with encouragement, with understanding, with kindness. And it's not rocket science, but it can feel uncomfortable at first, and it takes a little bit of effort. But from my experience, I've taught thousands and thousands of people now how to be more self-compassionate. Pretty much even kids with really severe trauma histories, they can learn how to do it, but it just may be a little more scary. They may have to go more slowly, and you may have to do it with the help of a therapist. But it is possible for everyone. And
is it done through self-talk? Is that how they get themselves in the beginning out of the pattern of feeling bad about or talking bad to themselves? So
self-talk, kind of kind, supportive, friendly self-talk is a very important venue. Another really important way to be kinder to yourself is actually through a physical touch. We know because we're mammals that physical touch is like one of the strongest signals of compassion. So for instance, Dr. Keltner at UC Berkeley, he's done this great research where you can put your hand through a box. You don't even see the person on the other side of the box. And if they're touching you, kindly, compassionately, or aggressively, or indifferently. So touch is a really powerful signal of care. So one of the things we do in our workshops is we help people find a way of touching themselves that feels kind and supportive, like putting your hands on your heart, or cradling your face, or holding your own hand, giving yourself a self-hug. I mean, the same thing doesn't work for everyone. Some people, the idea of giving themselves a hug just wants to make them gag. And if that's you, then don't do that. Do something else. But nonetheless, the idea that you can use your physical warm touch to trigger your body's, basically it's your mammalian caregiving system. It releases oxytocin and opiates, and it helps you feel safe and accepted and cared for. And sometimes that's a more direct pathway than self-talk. Sometimes your head just can't go there. It's too full of the storyline of, how flawed you are. But your body can go there. So, and also tone of voice is really important. We're very sensitive to tone. So sometimes it's not even so much what you say, but it's how you say it, that again, we really respond to. So there's a lot of access points into self-compassion.
And I know from having a 20-year practice, a homeopathic clinical practice, I had a lot of patients that kind of self-abuse, and even just, I'm talking more like cutting and all kinds of horrible abusive behavior on their self. But just the talk that people can say to themselves day in and day out can be so damaging on our health and our nervous system. Yes. Can you speak a little bit about that, the science behind the health of negative talks to yourself?
So basically what's happening when we criticize ourselves is, and also we shouldn't criticize herself for criticizing herself, because it's actually a natural response. What happens is whenever we perceive some sort of threat or some sort of danger, our first instinctual response is to go into threat defense mode, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. So we release cortisol and adrenaline, and we get ready to, save ourselves from whatever danger there is. Now, the system evolved for physical threats to our bodily selves, but what happens is it's triggered just as easily to any threat to our self-concept. So if we make a mistake, or we get rejected by someone, or we don't like the way we look in the mirror, we actually feel threatened. And the way we solve the problem is either we attack ourselves verbally through self-criticism, like, I'm going to beat myself up to get myself in line, but basically to keep myself safe. Or else we kind of isolate ourselves. We run from the problem. We just don't think about it, or we isolate ourselves from other people. We hide in shame. Or else sometimes we freeze. The freeze response, it kind of looks like rumination. When you think about the problem for the 57th time, maybe then it will go away. We kind of get stuck in our heads. That's actually the freeze response. And so what happens when your threat defense system is constantly activated, when your amygdala is triggered, releasing all this cortisol and adrenaline, is it starts to have a real toll on your body. So one of the things self-compassion does is it triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, oxytocin, opiates, etc., reduces the sympathetic response, and that has lots of good health effects. Like, for instance, we did one study teaching self-compassion to diabetes patients, and it stabilized their glucose levels. So we know the body responds to this more healthy way of relating to yourself.
Well, we're learning so much about the brain. I've had a doctor by the name of Dr. Hanscom on who deals with a lot of chronic pain patients, and there's a training that this other doctor does. I can't think of his name, but he works on retraining the amygdala of the brain. So we're learning so much, and most of these people will tell you how damaging that adrenaline response is to the body. I've sure seen it in my practice. Like, even just, let's say someone gets some horrible news. Maybe it's even that they had cancer, but it could be that a family member has passed, or maybe they were in a plane accident and they got into a big shock. When you get that big surge of adrenaline, it's not by chance that shortly after that period that they can go into a horrible disease, because it's so damaging on the body. But the kind of response that you're talking about is like this chronic shooting of adrenaline, because if you're talking to yourself on a daily basis negatively, then just imagine it's like this slow poisoning of adrenaline to the body.
Yeah, that's right. And so the really amazing thing about self-compassion is that, so let's say you do get that call that a loved one has died from cancer or something like that. You can actually, in that moment of pain, emotional pain, even, let's say it has nothing to do with self-criticism, it's just something really painful happens. You can actually soothe and comfort yourself. You can give yourself a physical gesture of support. You can validate your pain, like, this is so hard for me right now. I'm so stricken with grief. You can, say words of kindness. I'm so sorry this has happened. How can I help myself get through this? What can I do just to be here for myself in this difficult moment? And what happens is we aren't getting rid of the pain, because we know that doesn't work very well, but we're embracing the pain with this sense of warmth and kindness and care, which actually counteracts some of the negative effects of the pain. So again, like, even though we've got our sympathetic response going, we also activate the parasympathetic response, the kind of, think of a crying child held in its mother's arms. The child starts to finally calm down and feel safe and quiet. The mother's not trying to get that baby to stop crying. It's just saying, oh, I'm so sorry, it's so hard for you. And just the kind of the warmth and support actually helps the child calm down more naturally. And that's really self-compassion. Yeah. And
also what a lot of research has shown, and these doctors have said on my interviews with them, that actually using, whether it's self-compassion or self-talk, to actually try to make the pain go away is actually more dangerous than feeling the pain, because he was saying it can damage the hippocampus if you actually suppress the emotion.
Interesting. Well, I'm not sure about the hippocampus research, but I do know that emotional avoidance, that we know there's actually a whole field of psychology on this, that it actually makes it worse. If you try to suppress pain or suppress thoughts, they actually end up being strengthened, counterintuitively. So we don't want to avoid or suppress, but we also do want to try to hold. I think it's a really nice image that you hold the pain. You don't get rid of it, but you also have a sense of safety and support, even in the midst of feeling threatened. And that's what keeps it from being so overwhelming.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I know you talk about 3 parts of self-compassion. Can we go over those?
Yes. So when I've been learning about self-compassion, and I've been starting to practice Buddhism, but it hadn't really been talked about in an academic context. So I knew I needed a clear operational definition. So yes, there is the kindness element that's kind of self-evident. But actually, I realized that, first of all, self-compassion requires mindfulness. And there's a lot of work on mindfulness these days. Mindfulness basically means a little bit like we were talking about, acknowledging the pain as opposed to trying to repress it or as opposed to running away with it. It just means kind of taking a step outside of yourself and saying, wow, this is really hard for me right now. So mindfulness, that ability to be aware of what's happening as it's happening, is kind of the first step of self-compassion. And then again, we need to respond with this kindness, with this warmth, with this support. But then the third element of self-compassion, which I didn't realize had to be there at first, but it really does, because it's very important to distinguish self-compassion from self-pity. Self-pity is, poor me. And you know how we like to get compassion from other people, but we hate to get other people's pity. So what is pity?
Yeah.
Pity is when you're looking down on someone, when it's unequal. So when you're lost in self-pity, it's like somehow I'm the only one in the world that's suffering and that's struggling. And it's a very self-focused, self-absorbed attitude. And that's actually not healthy at all. So what self-compassion entails, it's a sense of common humanity. The word compassion itself, come with, passion, suffering, to suffer with. There's always a sense of connectedness in compassion as opposed to pity. So with compassion, it's like, we all suffer. This happens to all of us. And absolutely the same with self-compassion. It's just remembering that the human experience is imperfect, that all people make mistakes, that all people struggle. It's not just me. It doesn't mean you belittle your own experience, but you don't exaggerate it either. It kind of frames it in this larger human context. And actually, one of the strengths that gives you is, instead of feeling isolated in your struggle, I mean, let's face it, most people, when they make a mistake or they get that cancer call from the doctor, they feel like something has gone wrong. Something has gone terribly wrong. This is not supposed to happen. It's like, well, actually, who said? This is the plan we all signed up for, right? This is what it means to be human. So we can actually, when we struggle, we can actually feel connected to other people. This is what makes me a card-carrying member of the human race, the fact that I struggle with these things, the fact that I make mistakes. And so it really, it switches the isolation of self-pity to the deep interconnectedness of self-compassion, and that's one of its real strengths.
Time to take a break and walk around and stretch or get a drink. And while you do that, I just want to ask you guys to be sure and share this show, not only this episode, but just the show in general, because as you know, we need to get the word out to try to help as many people as possible. I hope you guys are enjoying the show and learning a lot and helping your family and friends and passing on all the knowledge from what you've learned here to everyone that you can, because that way it becomes a movement and not just my effort to help people. And of course, I want to say thank you to all of you out there that are using the Amazon banner from my website. I so appreciate that. It really means a lot to me. When you go to my website, I also want you to check out the shop button and look there. I have lots of cool items that I recommend and that I use. And the water distiller is there, and the link to the ionic minerals that I use is there. Those are all really important items to learn about and to begin using. So if you're going to buy those, I'd appreciate you do it from my website. All right, you guys, now let's get back to the show. Well, that makes me think about, because when you're talking about this human connectedness, and then I think where society is today, because it seems like people are, I don't know, more isolated or more me, or more narcissistic, but it certainly feels to me like less people are compassionate, and I'm not even saying to themselves, I'm just saying to humanity in general. So that leads me to say that, wow, I kind of feel like there's so much more narcissism in the world today than there was even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it feels like it's growing, and that means to that compassion, or that automatic compassionate response in people, is lessening. And I just wonder if you feel that too, or do you not think that narcissism is a bigger problem? It's just always been there?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at it scientifically, we do know that narcissism levels have raised. And again, researchers tie this to the self-esteem movement. But on the other hand, I also know that in many ways, respect for diversity, or people even talking about, gender equality or racial equality or some of these things, that's also stronger than it's ever been. So I think it's both, right? So for instance, if you look at people's use of the iPhone, well, in a way that isolates them, but also in a way it connects them. So I think it's just very, very complex. I think it's not really helpful to think of it as people used to be kinder and more compassionate, and they're worse and more narcissistic now, more selfish, because in some ways I think we have made some advances. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that women weren't paid equally, or, a lot of these things we almost take for granted now, equality for the LGBTQ, I'm going to say that wrong, community. Right. I mean, I would say that's an advance toward less selfishness, less isolation. So it's hard to say, but certainly things are more complicated than they used to be. And I think things are in some ways more extreme than they used to be. So I think we need as many tools in our tool belt as possible to deal with it. And I think mindfulness and compassion are very important tools that luckily are starting to, be taken more seriously than certainly they were 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. And mindfulness, so many people speak about it for overcoming so many things. Even that example you were talking where someone's just ruminating and that thought goes over and over in their head. I mean, if you practice mindfulness, that's a technique that can stop that. But just mindfulness in general, even if you do or say something, and if you're mindful about it, then you could easily forgive yourself or accept what it was. But so I think that's, as you said, that's the part that's really growing and helpful, because there's more and more research how these kinds of things matter. So I see what you're saying. It's kind of more about extremism. We have a lot of violence on one end, but then we have this other group of people that's growing that are really trying to spread the word and, are more compassionate than ever before and more accepting than ever before. So it's just kind of at both ends now and not as balanced because there's so much work being done to kind of get the message out. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. But if someone is a narcissistic person, does this come from their upbringing?
Well, that's a good question. So narcissism is considered one of the big 5 inborn personality traits. So some people would argue that there's some genetic component to it, but I think most people would also agree that there is a component to it that is how you're raised or the culture you're raised in, because we also see changes over time in narcissism. And so sometimes narcissism comes from people secretly hating themselves and not thinking they're good enough, and this is a cover for it. And for those people, I think self-compassion would be really good. Other people, I have to say, just really, really, really think highly of themselves, and maybe they already have self-compassion, then maybe they need something else other than self-compassion.
Humility.
Yeah, because self-compassion does bring humility because it allows you to admit your mistakes. And, one of the things about narcissism is people who are narcissistic, they can never admit their mistakes. They always have to blame other people. So,
right.
It's kind of complicated, but yeah, I do.
That was one of my questions. Does a narcissistic personality know they're narcissistic?
Well, usually they don't. No.
Yeah, that's what I would think, because they don't think they're wrong, and they think they're kind of better than everyone else, and they blame other people. So why would they think they have a fault?
Right. Yeah. And then oftentimes the roots of it are so deep down, they're outside of awareness.
And do you think narcissistic people, if it's more that deep and it's not from self-hate, could benefit from being self-compassionate, or would they not even feel they need to do the work?
Yeah, I think it would really just depend. I think some people they would just say, what do you mean? I'm already nice to myself, and they wouldn't even think about it. It would be almost like wasted on them. In order to really get at the roots of it, you'd have to be willing to go down to some deep old wounds, which people may or may not be able to do. Now, if anyone was willing to go there, there's no doubt that self-compassion would help, because it's an antidote to shame. A lot of times narcissism is a kind of a cover for shame. Not always, but often it is. And so anyone for whom, if you were able to at least touch the shame somehow and realize that that's the root, then self-compassion would be very, very useful. But you can't throw self-compassion at someone from the outside. They've got to want to be this way with themselves. So, it's you can't say, oh, my Uncle Bob is so narcissistic, I'm going to give him the self-compassion book. It's probably not going to do much.
Right. And because I'm a homeopath and a classical homeopath, we, treat the whole person, including their nature, their personality, and their family history and their symptoms. And we have so many remedies that have kind of personality profiles because it's been around since the 1700s. So we know lots and lots about the tendencies of certain remedies. And when you were talking about the person that underneath really dislikes themselves, maybe even hates themselves, and they kind of inflate their ego to hide that. Yeah. We have a remedy in homeopathy called lycopodium, and they kind of inflate up as if they're better, but underneath they really lack confidence, lack self-esteem, really don't like themselves. And so it's really interesting to see, the interconnectedness of how people doing all kinds of different work kind of experience these same personality traits, and how much it can affect our health and the brain and just our interactions with each other. It's so cool, though, really, in a way. There's so much being done to help people heal and be happy, and there's so much information out there that sometimes it's just too much, but it's certainly helpful if you know how to weed through it all.
Yes, yeah. Well,
there's just a lot out there.
There's a lot. I think the nice thing about self-compassion is it's really very, very simple. It's just be a good friend to yourself. Would you say that to a friend? Would you act that way to a friend? Often the answer is no. Okay, so then what would you say to a friend? How would you treat someone you really cared about? It's usually kind of obvious. So it's really quite a simple practice. It doesn't require hours of meditation like mindfulness does. It doesn't require, any particular knowledge of how the body works. All it requires is knowing what it looks like to be a good supportive friend. And like I say, luckily, most people have some experience with that. So
yeah, that's true. It does sound fairly simple, and then people aren't overwhelmed to at least begin, and then they can see the progress, and that makes anybody keep doing the work.
Right. Yeah.
But the other thing about narcissism, do you think that personality type are less compassionate because they're in that state of narcissism?
Well, certainly to the extent that the narcissism keeps you self-focused and not very interested in other people's issues, of course, it's going to impact your ability to be compassionate to others. It probably won't impact how well you score on a compassion for others test. So
Right.
maybe out of awareness, but yeah.
And it might not even affect their self-compassion, because if they're so confident, they may be treating themselves okay. But in general, the external compassion, I would find, would be missing more.
Yeah.
And do you think that people in general who are more compassionate tend to be more self-compassionate?
Now that actually is not true. One would think so. But what we find is that, and I kind of thought that the two would tend to go hand in hand, but so many people are very kind, compassionate people to others and treat themselves so radically differently that being compassionate to others does not mean you're compassionate to yourself. What I'm finding in my research, and I'm still working on actually quantifying this, but something like 80% of people are more compassionate to others than themselves. The vast majority of people treat themselves radically differently. So, what we do know is, like, if you learn to be more self-compassionate, it helps you be more compassionate to others. But it's not necessarily the case that it works the other way. So it really
very interesting. Maybe the example of a caretaker, they caretake for someone else. Maybe like, let's say there's a couple and the wife has Alzheimer's or cancer, and the other person's caretaking for them all around the clock, and they do it to the detriment of their own health, of their own balance. They can go so far out of the norm that they're killing themselves to take care of someone else. That's a form of being so compassionate to others, but not very aware and compassionate to yourself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So that's where I'm actually working on a self-compassion training program for caregivers, for healthcare workers, because what happens is if you give and give and give, but you just beat yourself up and you don't really take care of yourself, is you will burn out. So it's absolutely necessary to, not only take care of yourself in terms of physical care and self-care, which is important, but when you are caring for someone else and you're feeling their pain, to actually take the time to acknowledge and validate that it's really hard for me right now. If you're taking care of your father who has Alzheimer's, most people think, oh, it's selfish to complain about the fact that it's hard for me. Well, actually, if you don't acknowledge and validate that your own pain and having to take care of your father father who's suffering, and you don't actually be kind to yourself and supportive to yourself and say, this is so hard, I'm here for you. If you don't actually give yourself compassion, you will not have the resources needed to take care of your father. So the two are absolutely interconnected. But, a lot of people, especially women, the difference between how women treat themselves and others is greater than how men treat themselves and others. Men have a little more self-compassion than women do, and they have less compassion for others than women do. So, and
what age does that start for women? What is it, as children they start losing it, or as adults?
Yeah, it's kind of it's not that they lose it; it's just that they never really had it, right? This self-compassion.
I was just wondering if, because of physical looks, there's so much more pressure on women than men. And so I wondered if little girls start, losing or maybe never get it as much as a little boy at that certain age.
Self-esteem, right? So what you're referring to there is self-esteem. And it's certainly the case that we know in early adolescence, girls' self-esteem starts to take a nosedive, because for women, the number one source of self-esteem is physical appearance. So women start to lose their self-esteem in early adolescence, and it's really closely linked to their physical appearance. But it's a little different than self-compassion. Basically, the gender roles for women always include being kind and compassionate to others, but they do not include being kind and compassionate to yourself. Actually, they don't. For men as well. But what men don't have is the real emphasis on self-sacrifice that women do get. women get this.
Right. Well, generations, women have taken care of their husbands and families, and that was their work.
Exactly. That's part of the reason why women tend to definitely have more compassion and empathy for others. There may be some biological component to that, some evolutionary function for women to be more empathetic and focused on, caring for others. It's certainly probably both. Most things, the answer is both. But men aren't as self-critical as women are, and they definitely aren't as passionate to others. Some are. Of course, some men are very in touch with their inner feminine. So it just depends on the individual. But in general, in terms of broad brushstrokes, you might say the discrepancy between how women treat themselves and others is much more extreme than that for men.
I expect that when you kind of look at the history of the roles of women.
That's right.
So, and now I would like to ask you a little bit about Buddhism, just in general, your experience with it. But since a young age of like 11, I loved animals, and I became a vegetarian vegan, have been ever since. And part of Buddhism, not all Buddhists, but some, they definitely promote the idea of compassion to all and to everything, every being. And I know many of them that were vegetarian or vegan. And so for me, it was something that I always loved about them. Just this whole idea is treat all of life with compassion. And I just wonder if you feel that element of Buddhism is still very at their core, this whole idea about compassion to everything and everyone with the state of our planet and all the violence in the world, and just how we treat each other. Do you think Buddhism is still promoting this idea of compassion at its core?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Buddhism is all about compassion. So if you look at like the compassion movement in the United States, even the scientific movement, a lot of that is funded actually by the Dalai Lama has an institute called the Mind and Life Society, whose one of their main goals is to advance research on compassion. He's very interested in bringing together science and some of these more philosophical ideas. So I would definitely say that in the West, the merging of Buddhism and science has led to both the mindfulness movement and the compassion movement. But for instance, the Dalai Lama is not a vegetarian, so it's not totally cut and dry.
Right. And no, that's so interesting for me, because I know there's like a sect that are and a sect that are not. And part of them say they don't kill the animal, but if it was killed, or I don't know, there's something like that for whatever reason. But I know in general that is their philosophy about not harming any life and to be compassionate for all. And I've always loved that about them, although that has always felt like a little bit of a hiccup for me. But there's just some things I don't understand, especially now because we're in such a dire straits with our planet. And it just feels like the lack of awareness about what we're eating or doing or using up. I think people are moving more in the direction of being more mindful. And maybe it starts out because they get sick and there are so many sicknesses and people are dying younger, and it's the first year that our life expectancy actually went down. So health is in a crisis right now, and maybe it's coming out of that. I know longtime vegans that started as vegans said, I don't really care about the other thing. I'm just doing it because I want to be healthier. But eventually they feel more compassionate to all, including animals and their planet. So it's always a beautiful transition to see someone that starts on that path. You see how they evolve, whether it's just to other beings or in general. But that's a pattern I've definitely seen being a long-time vegetarian vegan. It's been beautiful to watch. I would like to know on the science of self-compassion, what does the research and the science show that it's helping people heal?
Right. So by far the vast majority of the research has been done on psychological healing, right? That we know, for instance, that self-compassion is linked to less depression and anxiety and less eating disorders, things like that. So there is a little bit of research. It's not as well developed for sure, but like showing that it's linked to better immune function. Like I said, we did one study training people with diabetes in our mindful self-compassion program. and they stabilize their glucose levels. There's one study showing that the common humanity component of self-compassion is linked to longer telomeres. Several studies showing that it's linked to, like, for instance, increased heart rate variability and decreased salivary cortisol, two things that we know are linked to healthy, body function. So the research is in its infancy in terms of its effect on the body, but it's definitely starting to be there. And that makes sense because, obviously that there's a lot of overlap between how depressed or anxious you are and how your body's functioning. It's just
for sure.
Most of the research so far has been done more on the psychological end. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's why I was asking about the actual physical end, because it seems like the results would have to be there.
Yeah.
And what about, tell us what you're working on now. What are you doing these days, and where is your interest going? I know you were telling me you're working on a new course, so can you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, so, I've done a lot of research on self-compassion, but now my interest is really on intervention, how to help people learn how to be more self-compassionate. So with my colleague, Chris Germer, actually, it's been a while now. In 2010, we developed the Mindful Self-Compassion course. And this is an 8-week training program that you can learn how to be more self-compassionate. And there's a fair amount of research showing the benefits of the course. And that's taught all over the world now. We've got the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. We're in every continent except Africa. Not Antarctica either.
Wow.
Other than that, so it's really kind of a global movement. So I've been spending a lot of time on that. I'm coming out with Chris and I are coming out with an online version of the course in October with Sounds True, which is 8 one-hour sessions, because although, the course is all over the world, it's still kind of hard to access. For most people, they don't have access to a mindful self-compassion course in their local community. So we're really moving more to online now, so people can, if you go to my website, selfcompassion.org, you'll find a link for that. I'm really interested in helping people learn this skill. Like I said, I'm working with the healthcare workers now, a briefer training that doesn't require any meditation to help. So for stressed healthcare workers, they can learn this skill when they're working with their patients. So that's really the main thrust of my focus now, is teaching people how to do it. We know I'm convinced it works. I don't need to convince myself anymore. I know it works. So
yeah, right. And now by doing an online course, it just gives easy access for everyone. And you said that's going to start in October?
Yes, right. Through Sounds True. So they did a really nice job of condensing, because it's normally 8 2.5-hour sessions, and they condensed it into 8 one-hour sessions and broke it up into little chunks. The whole idea is to try to make it as user-friendly as possible, which I think is really important. So
yeah, people tend to do things more when they're, not feeling overwhelmed by time.
That's right. Or have time, or on their own schedule, as opposed to having to go to a class and get in the car, et cetera. So
yeah, well, that's exciting. And can they go to your site now and sign up for it?
Yes. Well, the links will be up in late September, and the course starts in October, and there's going to be several. So the course rolls out week by week, and there's some online mentoring sessions with choices of times available. And if you don't make the first round, there'll be second and third rounds. So you can just, again, and my website also, I've really spent a lot of time to make it a free resource for people. So I've got all the research articles on there. I've got guided meditations. I have exercises. You can test your own self-compassion level on my site. So if you just go to selfcompassion.org, it's kind of your one-stop resource to learn all about self-compassion. So
yeah, I saw you had a lot of nice meditations up there.
Yeah.
That's great. And what about, can you leave the listeners with 3 tips, just maybe something how they can feel more balanced in their self-compassion, or even just be more compassionate in general? What 3 things would you tell them to think about?
Yeah. So again, the easiest way to access self-compassion is really just, I would say, take a moment to ask yourself, how do you treat yourself when you fail or make a mistake or you're struggling? What types of things do you say to yourself? What tone of voice do you use with yourself? And And then contrast that with how you treat your good friends when your friends make a mistake or struggle or, are suffering in some way. What tone of voice do you use? What types of things do you say to your friends? And then really just notice what are the patterns of difference between how you treat yourself and how you treat your close friends. And then you can actually start to intentionally treat yourself like a good friend. Right? It doesn't mean you're better than other people. It's not selfish. It's just you're just, again, having that very humble agenda of including yourself in the circle of compassion, including yourself with your friendly, supportive attitude as opposed to beating yourself up and giving all your care to others. And that's really just the easiest way to start being more compassionate to yourself, just noticing how you treat yourself and treating yourself more like you treat your friends.
That's cool. And I think, like you said, one thing that's very clear, that self-compassion is just more about embracing all of ourselves, including the failures, the pain, the feelings, right? Instead of trying to make the pain go away or the failure become less, it's just embracing all of ourselves. And who can't benefit from learning how to do that? So I think this is really great because you're not suppressing anything. You're just learning to accept it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Okay, and do you ever Twitter or Facebook? Are there any other?
Yeah, I've got Twitter. It's like if you go to my website on the contact, it's got the links, but I think it's self_compassion is my Twitter handle, and self-compassion is the Facebook page. Basically, if you Google self-compassion, you can spell it any way you want, you'll find me.
Good.
So, luckily I've got kind of a bit of a corner on the market, so to speak, because I was the first one to start writing about it, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Very good. Well, Dr. Neff, thank you so much today for taking the time and kind of explaining the difference. I know it's all intertwined, self-esteem, self-compassion, narcissism. So I really think that I learned a lot to kind of put it into its own compartments and just to realize that it's really about just accepting all of ourselves.
Yes.
And be nice to yourself and treat yourself like you would treat your best friend.
Yeah, including sometimes you got to kick your friend in the butt, so it's not just about indulgence, right? Your friend's really doing something wrong, you say, hey, stop it. And that can also be for ourselves as well. So
so it's like just being honest.
That's right. In a supportive way as opposed to a destructive way. So
yeah. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, and you have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thank you.
So how was that one? I was really happy to hear that self-compassion is so simple. I think it's mostly about just being aware or mindful how we treat ourselves. Once we have it in our consciousness, then we can at least recognize it when we're not treating ourselves very well. And once we become more aware, then it's always easier to make changes, don't you think? Awareness is always the key to so many things in life. I love that little book that Dr. Hanscom recommended by Anthony DeMello. It's called The Way to Love. It's all about awareness, and it's this little tiny book, but it's filled with wisdom, so check it out. And speaking of books, be sure to check out Dr. Neff's book called Self-Compassion if you want to learn more about her work. And don't forget to check out her online course, which starts next week. So go to her website and check it out and sign up for that new course that she's offering. She teaches this course all over the world and is now offering it online. So take advantage of that. And also on her website, you should check out her guided meditations and her articles so you can learn more. All right, you guys, I'm not going to keep you any longer, but I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Neff. You know what time it is, right? Yep, it's time to say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed the show today, my friends. Till next week, stay well, eat lots of plants, and talk to yourself kindly. Ta-ta for now. Vidal has spoken. Remember, you heal with a plant-powered diet, homeopathy, and detoxing, of course. Peace. Be healthy. Be free. Live life.